Have you ever felt something precious slipping away from you? A skill you worked for years to master, a memory you held dear, a part of yourself that felt so fundamental. Its absence left you feeling hollow. Imagine that loss was your very ability to wield magic, the core of your identity, in a world where the arcane flows like a second heartbeat. This is the desperate reality for a young scholar named Alara, whose story begins not with a grand quest, but with a quiet, terrifying act of defiance. Welcome, everyone. We're about to step into the forgotten corners of Tamriel, into the abandoned libraries that hold secrets far darker and more profound than any simple spellbook. And as we begin this journey into realms of magic and memory, we'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight and what time it is where you are. Let us know in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our community spread across the world, united by a shared curiosity for the mysteries of the past. Elara's world is one of fading light. Once a promising member of the Mage Guild, she now watches helplessly as her magical abilities drain away, an unexplained decay that no mentor can cure and no text can explain. It's a deeply personal crisis, a silent erosion of self that pushes her to a point of no return. Driven by a mix of fear and stubborn hope, she turns her back on everything she knows. She ignores the grave warnings of her teachers, the threat of permanent exile hanging over her, and does the unthinkable. Under the cover of a misty twilight on Somerset Isle, Alara breaches the ancient, sealed entrance to the Ceporah Tower library. This is no simple archive. It is a place forbidden for a reason, a tomb for knowledge deemed too dangerous or too fragile to remain in the world. The air is thick with the dust of centuries, and every shadow seems to hold its breath. Her goal is singular, to find a cure before the last flicker of her power goes out. But the true risk is far greater than just being cast out from the guild. The library is protected by ancient, dormant wards defenses that don't just kill, but are said to erase intruders entirely, wiping them from history as if they never were. This single moment, this gamble in the dark, is the spark that ignites an epic exploration. Alara's personal struggle is our gateway into understanding a much larger, hidden truth about the world of Tamriel. Her journey will force us to ask profound questions. What happens to knowledge when it is deliberately forgotten? What kind of power resides not in the spells we cast, but in the memories we preserve? And what ancient, sleeping threats might we awaken when we dare to uncover what was meant to stay lost? The abandoned libraries of Tamriel are more than just crumbling ruins. They are living, breathing entities, guardians of histories too volatile for the modern world. They hold the echoes of lost realms of magic and the answers to catastrophes so old their names have been scrubbed from time itself. So, settle in. Together, we will follow Elara's path through dust-choked corridors and sinking cities, facing ethereal parasites and conceptual voids, all to uncover what these silent archives reveal about the very nature of memory, sacrifice, and the fragile light of knowledge in a world that sometimes chooses to forget. Inside the Ceporah Tower, the air itself feels heavy with forgotten time. Alara's first fragile light spell is a small defiance against an ocean of darkness, a trembling sphere of mage light that casts long, dancing shadows down corridors choked with the dust of ages. Every step is a negotiation with decay. She has to physically shoulder aside fallen bookcases, their wood groaning and splintering at her touch, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The walls are lined with glyphs, their carved lines faded almost to smoothness, and she runs her fingers over them, whispering the meanings she can still recall. This is not just navigation, it is an act of desperate archaeology, a race against the physical collapse of history itself, and with every passing minute, the weight of her transgression grows heavier. The light spell, a simple cantrip she could once maintain in her sleep, begins to falter. It flickers like a dying candle, dimming to a faint amber glow before she forces more of her own dwindling energy into it, a stark and terrifying confirmation. Her magical decay isn't just a passive condition, it's being actively accelerated by this place, as if the library's ancient defenses are siphoning her very essence as a toll for her intrusion. The true test comes when her light washes over a small, ornate desk tucked into an alcove. On it rests a journal, bound in what looks like scaled leather, appearing remarkably intact. But a faint, shimmering ward glows to life around it as she approaches a protective field that hums with a power far older and more potent than her own fading magic. Here, the conflict becomes agonizingly immediate. She can feel the precious reserves of power within her, the last embers of what makes her a mage. To use even a fraction of it to bypass this ward could mean a complete magical burnout, leaving her utterly defenseless in this treacherous environment. Yet, to leave the journal untouched, to walk away from what might be the only clue to her salvation, is an impossible surrender. This single choice, made in the flickering half-light, defines her entire character in this moment. It is a decision born of pure, raw desperation, a stubborn refusal to accept her fate without a fight. Gritting her teeth, she presses her palms against the shimmering barrier, channeling not a sophisticated spell, but a raw surge of her remaining life force into it. The ward resists, pushing back with a force that feels like a physical blow, but her willingness to sacrifice everything creates a crack. For a heartbeat, the barrier shatters. Her hands shake as she grabs the journal, but the victory is cruelly fleeting. The moment she opens the cover, the pages, preserved by magic for centuries, cannot withstand the touch of the open air. They begin to crumble at the edges, disintegrating into fine, gray dust that sifts through her fingers. She has only seconds to read, her eyes scanning the elegant script frantically. Most of it is lost, but one phrase burns itself into her mind, a reference to the Nemic Egg, a mythical artifact spoken of in hushed tones in the most theoretical circles of the guild. It was said to be a vessel of pure memory, capable of storing and restoring knowledge itself. Her quest is instantly transformed. It is no longer just about finding a cure for her own affliction. She has stumbled upon the trail of a legend, an object that could rewrite history. But as the last page turns to dust in her hands, the silence of the archive is broken by a new, entirely physical sound. The faint, unmistakable echo of shifting stone from somewhere deeper in the darkness. She is not alone. For a heart-stopping moment, Alara freezes, every muscle locked tight. The sound of shifting stone echoes again, closer this time, a dry grating noise that is utterly deliberate. It is not the settling of an old ruin, it is the sound of movement. Panic screams at her to flee, to extinguish her fragile light, and hide in the absolute blackness. But flight is what prey does, and she knows that in a place like this, acting like prey will get you killed. Instead, she forces a shaky breath and does the opposite. She moves not away from the sound, but toward the periphery of her failing light, using the environment as her shield. Her eyes catch on a massive, petrified root system that has erupted through the cracked marble floor, a fossilized relic of a time when nature fought a losing battle against arcane architecture. She slips behind its gnarled bulk, the stone cool and rough against her back, and peers through a narrow gap. The combined glow of her own sputtering mage light and a second, steadier torchlight source reveals the intruder. It is not a spectral guardian or a skittering horror from the depths. It is a man. He is dressed in practical, travel-worn leathers, a satchel bulging with small, oddly shaped objects slung over his shoulder. His face is sharp, etched with a cynical alertness, and his eyes are actively scanning the room, not for knowledge, but for valuables. He is Kaelen, a rogue antiquarian, and as his torch beam sweeps over the very desk where Alara found the journal, he freezes. He sees the dust disturbed, the empty space where the book once lay. A flicker of annoyance crosses his features, quickly replaced by a predatory focus. He drops to a knee, brushing aside the dust near the desk leg, and his fingers close around a corner of parchment that had been hidden beneath it. It is a map fragment, older and more resilient than the journal that turned to dust. Elara realizes her hiding spot is compromised. Her own faint light gives her away. As Kaelin's head snaps up, his eyes locking onto hers, the tension becomes a physical thing, thick enough to taste. He rises slowly, the map fragment clenched in one hand, a dagger appearing in the other with practiced ease. He doesn't see a fellow scholar. He sees competition, an obstacle to the prophet he clearly intends to haul out of this tomb. That journal, he says, his voice a low, gravelly thing that carries easily in the silence. I trust you didn't just leave it lying around. The standoff is immediate and dangerous. It's a struggle for a key resource, a tangible clue in a sea of mysteries, and both of them know its value is incalculable. Alara's mind races. A fight is the last thing she can afford. Her magic is a dying ember, and this man moves with the confident lethality of someone who survives by his wits and his blade. Pride would demand she stand her ground, but pragmatism, honed by the terrifying acceleration of her condition, offers a different path. She slowly raises her empty hands, a gesture of non-aggression that feels terrifyingly vulnerable. The journal is gone, she states, her voice steadier than she feels. It turned to dust, but it mentioned something, an artifact, the Nemic Egg. She watches his face, seeing the recognition, and the avarice flare in his eyes at the name. This place is actively draining my magic, she continues, laying a card on the table, and I doubt its defenses care whether you can cast a spell or not. We are both trespassers here. If we fight each other, the library wins. We die in the dark, and whatever secrets this map holds die with us. Her proposal of a temporary truce is a calculated risk, a decision that showcases a surprising maturity. She is setting aside the immediate conflict for the sake of a greater goal, appealing not to his humanity, but to his sense of self-preservation. Kaelen studies her, his gaze calculating. He weighs her obvious weakness against the potential value of her knowledge, and the very real, creeping dread of the archive itself. After a long, tense silence, he gives a curt, reluctant nod, though the dagger doesn't fully lower. A truce, he grunts, but the moment you become a liability, the deal is off. The partnership is forged not in trust, but in mutual necessity, a fragile alliance that immediately escalates the personal danger. Every shared glance will be laced with suspicion, every step forward complicated by the need to watch one's back. He reluctantly unrolls the map fragment on the dusty desk, and they lean in together, their combined light finally illuminating the faded ink. The lines chart a path not through familiar, civilized lands, but toward a jagged, forbidding range sketched in the corner, the treacherous, snow-capped peaks of the Dragontail Mountains. The quest has just gained a partner, and a destination far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. Their combined light revealed the map in a way Alara's flickering spell could not, its steady glow showing details that made her scholar's heart beat faster. At first glance, it seemed like ordinary, if ancient, parchment, its edges cracked and brittle. But as Kaelen smoothed it flat on the dusty desk, the texture was all wrong. It was too supple, too strangely resilient, with a faint, pore-like pattern visible under the torchlight. Alara leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. This was no animal hide. The map was a tattoo, meticulously inscribed not on a dead surface, but on a piece of preserved skin, stretched and treated to last through the ages. The lines of mountain ranges and rivers were not drawn with ink alone. They were infused with pigments that had settled into the dermis, becoming a permanent, biological part of the scroll itself. The macabre nature of the artifact was inescapable, a piece of someone's body repurposed as a guide to forgotten places. Kaelen, who had been studying the map with the focused avarice of a treasure hunter, recoiled as if burned. He snatched his hand back, wiping his fingers on his leathers with a look of pure revulsion. The cynical confidence he had worn like armor shattered in an instant. By the 8, he muttered, his voice tight. What kind of monster does this? What kind of knowledge is worth? This, his reaction was visceral, a crack in his mercenary facade that revealed a line he hadn't known he possessed. For him, looting gold and artifacts from dusty tombs was one thing. This felt like a violation of something deeper, a transgression that stained the very act of seeking. The alliance, built on a foundation of shaky pragmatism, suddenly developed a fault line. He looked at Elara not as a partner, but as someone complicit in a horror he wanted no part of. This changes everything, he said, his tone wavering between anger and fear. This isn't treasure hunting anymore. This is something else, something cursed. Elara understood his horror, felt a twinge of it herself, but her desperation was a fiercer flame. She saw past the medium to the message. This wasn't mere monstrosity. It was a statement of ultimate priority. The ancient cartographers had used the most permanent canvas imaginable, a living record etched into flesh, because they believed the information was worth that sacrifice. It's horrible, she agreed, her voice low and earnest, refusing to look away from the map. But think about what it means, Kaelen. They didn't do this for a chest of gold. They did it because whatever lies at the end of this path was so important, so dangerous, that it couldn't be trusted to paper or stone. They made sure it would last. She had to bridge this new chasm of distrust, and she knew appeals to historical significance would fall on his deaf ears. He was motivated by base instincts, greed, and survival. She had to speak to one of them. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she had left. She turned from the map and met his troubled gaze. "My magic is fading," she said, the words simple and stark. "It's not just weak. It's draining away from me, hour by hour, and no one in the guild knows why. Being in this place is making it worse. That journal was my only lead. This," she gestured to the skin scroll, "is the only map. I'm not here for profit or glory. I'm here because if I don't find this Nemic Egg, I will lose a part of myself forever. I have nothing left to lose." It was the most vulnerable admission she could make, laying bare her true motive to a man she barely trusted. It transformed their dynamic in an instant. This was no longer a transaction between a scholar and a looter. It was a plea from someone facing an existential crisis to someone who might understand the value of a self. Kalin stared at her, the revulsion in his eyes slowly shifting to a dawning comprehension. He saw the raw fear she usually kept hidden, the tremor in her hands that wasn't from the cold. Her confession reframed the entire endeavor. The grotesque map wasn't a path to riches, it was a path to a cure. The moral ambiguity of their search was suddenly weighed against the very real, very personal tragedy unfolding before him. His internal conflict was palpable, the lure of potential reward, warring with a newly awakened fear of the unknown, and now, against a surprising flicker of sympathy. He was a rogue, not a monster. The thought of walking away and leaving her to this fate, after hearing her truth, felt like a different kind of betrayal. After a long, heavy silence, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping slightly in resignation. "All right," he grunted, the word sounding like it was dragged out of him. "But if we see anything else made out of people, we're turning back." His decision to stay was a monumental shift. It wasn't an enthusiastic agreement, but a reluctant acceptance that bound him to her quest on a profoundly personal level. Failure was no longer just a loss of profit. It would mean he had abandoned someone who had trusted him with her deepest vulnerability. The stakes of their partnership had been irrevocably raised. With the tension momentarily eased, they turned back to the map. Alara, pushing her own discomfort aside, used her knowledge of anatomy and ancient inks to read the biological clues. She pointed to where the pigment had faded along what would have been the original skin's stretch marks, indicating how to correct for distortion. Her scholarly interpretation revealed not just a location, but a condition. The next library wasn't marked as a building on land. The tattooed lines showed it nestled within the outlines of a city, but the ink around it was a murky, blotchy blue, and the city itself was depicted at a slight, sinking angle. The destination was the sinking city of Gideon, in the swamplands of Black Marsh, a library being consumed by the water itself. The journey to Black Marsh was a descent into a different world, a landscape where the very ground seemed to breathe with a wet, feverish heat. The air in Gideon was thick enough to drink, heavy with the scent of decay and blooming fungi, a far cry from the dry, scholarly dust of Somerset. The sinking city lived up to its name, a haunting silhouette of crumbling spires and drowned plazas rising from the murky water. half consumed by the relentless swamp. Navigating this watery graveyard required a shift in strategy. Their first task was constructing a pair of makeshift rafts from waterlogged timber and bundles of hollow reeds, a precarious craft that felt alarmingly fragile in the vast, silent channels of the sunken city. Progress was slow and nerve-wracking, each dip of a pole into the opaque water a gamble, never knowing what lay beneath the surface. The library itself was more a suggestion than a structure, its upper floors open to the elements, its lower levels completely flooded. To reach the heart of it, they had to abandon their rafts, take deep breaths, and dive down into the chilling darkness, feeling their way along slime-covered bookshelves that stood like tombstones in the murk. Elara's magic, now a ghost of a sensation in her fingertips, was worse than useless here. Attempting to conjure even a glimmer of light underwater felt like trying to grasp smoke. They worked in near-total blindness, their hands brushing against the soft, disintegrating pulp of waterlogged texts, the knowledge within them lost forever to the swamp. It was Kaelin's sharp eyes, accustomed to spotting value in the gloom, that found it. A chest, not of wood or iron, but of seamless, golden Dwemer metal, resting on a submerged dais as if placed there yesterday. It was unnaturally heavy, its surface cool and utterly unblemished by centuries underwater, a silent promise of answers. Hauling it back to the surface was a struggle that left them both gasping and exhausted, dragging it onto a partially collapsed balcony that served as their only dry foothold. But the splash and strain of their efforts had not gone unnoticed. The water around their perch began to ripple, then churn, as dark, sinuous shapes circled just below the surface. A low, chittering sound echoed from the flooded archways, and a pack of reptilian predators, with needle-sharp teeth and milky, aggressive eyes, began to haul their slick bodies out of the water, cutting off their escape. They were cornered, backs against a crumbling wall, the only exit blocked by a half-dozen advancing creatures. This was a conflict where Alara's traditional strength was a void. Her arcane knowledge meant nothing against snapping jaws and clawed feet. The fight was brutally mundane, a desperate ballet of evasion and blunt force. Kaelen, with his dagger, became the primary defender, his movements a frantic blur of parries and stabs. Alara fought with a broken shelf plank, her attacks clumsy but determined. The tension was a physical, choking thing. The shriek of the creatures, the splash of water, the sheer, animal terror of being hunted. In the midst of the chaos, Kaelin's self-preservation screamed at him to abandon the heavy chest, to use the distraction to save himself. He was, by his own admission, a coward, but as he saw Alara, weaponless and panting, cornered by two of the beasts, something in him broke and reforged in an instant. With a raw shout that was more fear than bravery, he didn't run. Instead, he did the opposite. He snatched up a loose piece of masonry and hurled it not at the creatures near Alara, but at a pile of debris across the room. The loud crash successfully drew the attention of the pack, their predatory focus shifting from the vulnerable scholar to the noisy, moving target. It was a decision that marked a fundamental change. This wasn't the calculated risk of their first meeting. This was a genuine sacrifice, a willing draw of danger onto himself to give her a chance. The chest. He yelled, already backing away as the creatures began to swarm toward him. Now, Elara, seizing the moment he had bought her, Alara turned to the Dwemer chest. It had no lock, no visible seam, but as she pressed her hands against its cool surface, she felt the faintest vibration. Remembering the tales of Dwemer craftsmanship, she didn't try to force it. Instead, she pressed her forehead against the metal, a gesture of supplication and focus, and poured the very last dregs of her magical awareness into it, not as a spell, but as a key. With a soft, resonant click, the lid unsealed. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet that was somehow still dry, was not a trove of scrolls or a detailed map. It was a single, palm-sized crystal, perfectly cut, and it pulsed with a soft, internal light, like a captured heartbeat. Their victory was Pyrrhic. They had survived the attack, the creatures retreating back into the water after a few more frantic minutes of fighting, but the prize felt bitterly small for the danger they had faced. Kaelen leaned against the wall, bleeding from a shallow gash on his arm, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bond between them was now solidified in shared survival, but a wave of despair threatened to overwhelm them. They had nearly died for this, a pretty rock, but as Alara held the crystal in her trembling hand, its gentle pulse seemed to quicken. She turned slowly, and the light within it brightened noticeably when she faced the northern wall of the ruin. When she turned away, it dimmed. This was not a conclusion. It was another pointer, a compass needle made of light. Their path, which had led them from dusty archives to a sinking city, was now pulling them toward an entirely new kind of danger, the frozen, unforgiving peaks of Skyrim. The crystal's silent guidance felt less like a promise and more like a sentence. The journey north into Skyrim was a brutal transition, a plunge from the oppressive, wet heat of the swamp into a world of pure, unforgiving white. The Dragontail Mountains lived up to their ominous name, their peaks like fangs against a steel-gray sky. They were barely halfway up the first treacherous pass when the weather turned. The wind, which had been a constant, moaning presence, sharpened into a shrieking gale, and the light snowfall escalated into a full-scale blizzard in a matter of minutes. Visibility dropped to mere feet, the world dissolving into a swirling, blinding chaos of ice and wind. The cold became a physical enemy, biting through their layers of furs and leather, seeking to steal the very warmth from their bones. Stumbling through the whiteout, their only goal was simple survival, to find any shelter before the storm claimed them. Their salvation was a dark, narrow crack in the mountainside, almost completely obscured by a drift of snow. It was Kalin, his eyes sharpened by years of searching for hidden entrances, who spotted it. They practically fell into the opening, collapsing onto the stone floor as the blizzard's roar was muffled to a distant, angry hum. For a long moment, they just lay there, gasping, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and cold. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the ice-blocked entrance, they realized this was no simple animal den. The walls were too smooth, too deliberately shaped, and there, just a few yards in, was a doorway, a massive stone archway sealed shut by a solid, opaque wall of ancient, blue-veined ice. It was not a natural formation. It was a deliberate barrier, thick and formidable. Their destination, the snow-buried library, was on the other side. There were no magical shortcuts here. Elara's power was a distant memory, a hollow ache where energy once flowed. The work was brutally physical, a test of pure endurance. They took turns using the only tools they had, Kaelin's dagger and a sharp-edged stone pried from the floor. They chipped, hacked, and scraped at the frozen wall, their muscles burning with the effort. The cold was a constant, draining presence, seeping into their hands until their fingers grew numb and clumsy. Progress was measured in inches, each fragment of ice that fell away a tiny victory in a seemingly endless battle. The conflict was no longer against monsters or rival seekers, but against the indifferent, crushing force of the environment itself. They had to work fast, not just to succeed, but to avoid succumbing to the hypothermia that threatened to lull them into a fatal sleep. The only sound was the rhythmic chipping of their tools and their own labored breathing, a desperate duet against the silence of the mountain. After what felt like hours, the last layer of ice gave way with a final, sharp crack, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. The air that washed over them was not just cold, but ancient and still, carrying the familiar scent of old paper and dust, now frozen in time. As they stepped through the archway, their torchlight fell upon a sight that froze the blood more effectively than any blizzard. Slumped against a bookshelf, covered in a fine layer of frost that glittered like diamonds, was the body of another seeker. It was a man, his features perfectly preserved by the deep freeze, his face locked in an expression not of pain, but of profound, startled realization. In his lap, clutched in hands that were more ice than flesh, was a leather-bound journal. He was a grim monument, a warning from the past that they were walking a path others had failed to complete. Kaelin's reaction was immediate and practical. "Don't touch anything," he whispered, his voice tight with superstitious dread. "We find what we need and get out." "This place is a tomb." He began to scan the frozen shelves, his looter's instincts taking over, seeing only the danger and the potential for valuable artifacts to salvage. But Alara stood transfixed, her scholar's heart aching at the sight. This wasn't just a corpse. It was a colleague, a fellow traveler on the same desperate road. He had sought knowledge just as she did, and had paid the ultimate price. Ignoring Kaelin's hissed warnings, she approached the frozen figure. "We can't just leave him like this," she said, her voice firm despite the cold. "Exposed, he deserves more. He deserves to be remembered." Kaelen stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Alara, we are freezing to death, and you want to dig a grave in solid rock." "This is sentimentality. It's a luxury we cannot afford." The tension between them flared again, a clash of world views as sharp as the mountain wind. For Kaelen, the past was dead weight. For Alara, it was a legacy to be honored. Her decision to insist on a burial, to use precious time and energy to carefully move the frozen seeker to a more respectful resting place among the stacks, was a defining moment. It wasn't just about respect for the dead, it was a statement of her own values. She was fighting for knowledge, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever sought it. As she gently pried the journal from the man's stiff fingers, Kaelen watched her, his cynical expression slowly softening into something akin to grudging respect. He saw in her actions an integrity he had long since abandoned, a spark of selflessness that stood in stark contrast to the frozen selfishness of the tomb. Once the seeker was laid to rest, they turned to the journal, their numb fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. The script was frantic, the handwriting deteriorating as the entries progressed. The early pages spoke of the same hope that drove Elara, The legend of the Nemic Egg, a chance to restore what was lost. But then the tone shifted. The writer began to complain of whispers, faint sounds that seemed to come from the very walls themselves, voices speaking in dead languages. He wasn't afraid of the cold or starvation. He was afraid of the silence being broken. The final entry was a single, terrifying sentence, scrawled in a shaking hand. It does not feed on flesh, but on memory. It is drinking the history from these stones, and now it knows I am here. The revelation struck them like a physical blow. The seeker hadn't died from exposure. He had been killed by the library's guardian, a memory parasite that consumed not life, but the very essence of magical history. The libraries weren't just dangerous places. They were actively defended by a threat that attacked the mind and soul. As the last word of the journal echoed in their minds, the cavern, which had been utterly silent except for their own breathing, was no longer quiet. At first, it was just a faint sensation, a vibration at the edge of hearing. Then it coalesced into a sound, a soft, sibilant whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was the sound of pages turning, of forgotten names being spoken, of spells unraveling. It was the sound the journal had described. The stakes had just escalated beyond mere survival. They were no longer simply explorers in a dangerous place. They were prey in the hunting ground of something they could not fight with blades or bravery, an entity that wanted to erase them from history itself, just as it had the Seeker now resting silently behind them. The true test of their journey was about to begin. The whispering was no longer just a sound. It began to condense in the air before them, drawing the faint light and the very cold of the cavern into a shimmering, indistinct form. It had no face, no limbs, no solidity, yet it possessed a terrifying presence, a vortex of ethereal energy that pulsed with the same rhythm as the forgotten spells lining the walls. This was the memory parasite, and its attack was unlike anything they had faced. It did not lunge or roar. Instead, a wave of profound emptiness washed over them, a pressure in their minds that felt like a siphon being applied directly to their souls. Alara gasped as a specific, cherished memory, the first time she had successfully conjured a flame in her palm, a moment of pure, childhood joy flickered at the edge of her consciousness, its edges fraying as if being tugged away into the void. The creature wasn't trying to kill their bodies. It was trying to consume their history, to erase the very experiences that defined their connection to the arcane. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. In that first second of assault, a desperate, shared instinct took hold. If the entity fed on magical memories, then they had to starve it. "Don't think about magic," Elara shouted, the words a struggle against the mental pull. She clamped her eyes shut, fighting to push away the image of glowing runes and swirling energies. Instead, she focused with all her might on the most mundane, tactile memory she could grasp, the specific smell of rain on hot stone in the courtyard of the Mage's Guild, a sensation that held no power, no spell, just a simple, sensory truth. Beside her, Kalin grunted in effort, his face a mask of concentration, as he too tried to bury his magical past, to make his mind a barren landscape. But the parasite was cunning. As Kaelen reinforced his mental shields, the entity shifted its focus, its form flowing like mist to brush against his shoulder. The physical touch was ice cold, but the mental effect was cataclysmic. Kaelin's eyes flew wide open, not with fear of the present, but with shock from the past. He was suddenly a boy of no more than 7 summers, standing in the long shadow of his family's modest farmhouse. He could feel the rough texture of the woolen tunic he hated, smell the earthy scent of turned soil, and see the way the late afternoon sun caught the wings of a dragonfly hovering over a rain barrel. It was a memory so ordinary, so completely buried by years of hardship and cynicism, that he had forgotten it entirely. The vivid, unbidden flashback was profoundly disorienting. It wasn't a happy memory or a sad one. It was just a piece of himself, a fragment of his identity he hadn't known was missing. The parasite's touch had not taken something away. It had reminded him of what he had already lost to time, and the violation of that intimate space was more frightening than any physical wound. This bizarre mental battle forced them to defend the core of who they were. They were no longer fighting for treasure or even for survival in the conventional sense. They were fighting for their right to have a past. Every memory, magical or mundane, felt like a fortress under siege. Elara, her own childhood starting to slip at the edges, knew they couldn't win a war of attrition. Their willpower was finite, and the parasite seemed to draw strength from the very history it consumed. Her hand went to the pouch at her belt, her fingers closing around the cool, smooth surface of the Dwemer crystal. It was their only artifact, their only tangible clue, and now it was their only weapon. It was a wild gamble, a decision born of pure, frantic experimentation. As the parasite swirled toward her again, she didn't throw the crystal or chant a spell. She simply held it out, focusing not on its light, but on the steady, rhythmic pulse she felt within it. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The crystal flared with a sharp, silent burst of energy, a wave of vibration that was felt rather than heard. The ethereal form of the parasite recoiled as if struck, its whispering rising to a shrill, dissonant screech of frustration. The pressure in Alara's mind vanished instantly. The crystal emitted a frequency that was anathema to the creature, a harmonic disruption to its feeding process. It was a reprieve, a life-saving discovery, but the victory was chilling. They had survived the attack, but the encounter had revealed the horrifyingly personal nature of the threat. Failure here would not mean a clean death. It would mean being hollowed out, becoming a blank slate, a person with no past, no identity, no reason for being. The cost of failure was the absolute loss of self. As the parasite retreated into the darker recesses of the cavern, its angry whispers fading, Alara clutched the crystal to her chest. Its pulse was no longer just a mysterious beacon. She could feel it now, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to echo not in the air, but within the hollow space where her magic once resided. The rhythm of the crystal had synchronized with the faint, almost imperceptible remnant of her own magical heartbeat. It was no longer just a tool or a guide. It felt like a part of her, the only piece of her former self that still answered her call, and their fates were now inextricably linked. The crystal's pulse was a drumbeat in the silence of the cavern, a rhythm that now felt as vital as Alara's own heartbeat. It no longer simply pointed north. It pulled, its light throbbing with an insistent urgency that seemed to originate from deep beneath their feet. The frozen library, with its whispering parasite now held at bay, was merely the antechamber. The true destination lay below. They found the entrance hidden behind the very bookshelf where they had laid the frozen seeker to rest. a fissure in the rock that was not a natural crack, but a perfectly square shaft descending into absolute darkness. A current of dry, strangely warm air flowed upward from the abyss, carrying a scent that was alien to the frozen mountain. The smell of sun-baked stone and ozone, the perfume of immense, dormant power. Their descent was a journey into the earth's memory. They used ropes from their packs to lower themselves, the darkness swallowing the light from their torch, until the only illumination was the crystal, which now glowed with a steady, fierce intensity. When their boots finally touched solid ground again, they found themselves not in another man-made library, but in a colossal, natural cavern. This was not built by masons. The walls soared upward into impenetrable blackness, and stretching out before them was a maze of towering stone monoliths, their surfaces unnaturally smooth, as if worn down by eons of flowing water that was no longer there. This was the heart of the labyrinth, a place not of books, but of experiences carved directly into the living rock. There were no corridors, no rooms, only a seemingly endless, chaotic web of pathways between the stones. Within minutes, the crushing scale of the place asserted itself. The pathways did not follow the logic of left or right. They curved back on themselves, twisted into spirals, and opened into identical-looking courtyards of stone. The crystal's light was their only guide, but its pull was omnidirectional, a constant hum that offered no clear path. They were utterly, profoundly lost. And then the walls began to speak. It started as a soft shimmer in the air, a heat haze effect that coalesced into a silent, ghostly tableau. They saw figures in ancient robes, their hands weaving spells of light that bloomed into fantastical, floating cities. It was a beautiful, majestic echo of a golden age of magic. But as they tried to move toward the vision, the path before them shifted. The smooth stone wall that had been there a moment before was gone, replaced by a new pathway that led in a completely different direction. The labyrinth was not a static puzzle. It was alive, rewriting itself around them. The echoes were the true trap. They were not mere recordings. They were reactive, feeding on the minds of the intruders. As Kaelin's anxiety spiked, the next vision to appear showed not glorious creation, but catastrophic failure. A magnificent spell unraveled before their eyes, the floating city crumbling into silent, spectral fire, and within the flames, Alara saw a face that looked hauntingly like her own, twisted in despair. The echo was showing her a distorted version of her greatest fear, that her quest would end not in restoration, but in a similar, spectacular ruin. For Kaelen, the visions were different. He saw vast treasure hoards being plundered by shadowy figures who laughed with his own voice, only for the gold to turn to dust in their hands, a mocking reflection of his own mercenary desires and the emptiness he had begun to feel. The labyrinth was holding up a mirror to their souls, using their own doubts and fears to mislead and disorient them. Trust, that fragile thread that had been woven through swamp fights and blizzards, began to fray under this psychological assault. This way, Elara would insist, following a pull of the crystal that she felt was true, only for Kaelen to grab her arm. No, look, that path just opened. The crystal is leading us in circles. We need to think, not feel. His voice was edged with a panic she hadn't heard since the skin scroll map. Every decision felt wrong. Every hopeful step was met with a shifting wall or a terrifying, personalized vision. The conflict was no longer against a physical enemy, but against the slow erosion of their sanity and their faith in each other. The labyrinth was testing the very foundation of their alliance, proving that the most dangerous walls are the ones we build in our own minds. After what felt like hours of futile struggle, Elara stopped in the center of a small, circular clearing, her body trembling with exhaustion. She closed her eyes, blocking out the terrifying echoes. She forced herself to stop fighting the maze, to stop trying to outthink it. Instead, she listened. She listened to the crystal's hum, not as a command, but as a conversation. She thought of the library's purpose, not as a prison for knowledge, but as a sanctuary. A place designed not to destroy seekers, but to test their worthiness. What if they were approaching this all wrong? What if the shifting walls and the painful echoes were not obstacles, but signposts? Kaelen, she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through his frustrated muttering. We're fighting it. We're trying to conquer it. What if we're supposed to? Follow it. It was a leap of faith that defied every logical instinct. It meant turning away from the path that seemed most clear and walking directly toward a vision that showed Kaelen dying alone and forgotten. It meant trusting that the library, in its own ancient, alien way, was guiding them, not hindering them. The decision was a watershed moment, when Kaelen, after a long, fearful hesitation, gave a grim nod and followed her into the heart of his own worst fear. The echo did not solidify into a wall. Instead, it dissolved, and the path behind it led not to a dead end, but to a long, straight avenue lined with monoliths that pulsed in time with the crystal. They were no longer lost. They were being led. The terrifying echoes now flowed around them, showing the full, unvarnished history of Tamriel's magic, the triumphs and the tragedies, without the personal, cruel distortions. They were finally seeing the library's truth, because they had stopped trying to force their own upon it. The avenue ended at a massive, circular archway that seemed to be carved from a single piece of obsidian. The crystal in Alara's hand flared with a light so bright it was almost painful, and then its pulse ceased altogether, becoming a steady, unwavering glow. They had reached the center, but their arrival was met not with triumph, but with a profound, heavy silence. The air in the chamber beyond the arch was perfectly still, and it grew thick with an energy that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. It was the scent of a storm about to break, of ozone and ancient, unimaginable power. The final chamber was before them, unguarded by shifting walls or spectral echoes. They had passed the labyrinth's test, but as they stepped across the threshold, they understood that the test was only the prelude. The true guardian of this place was waiting, and the sheer weight of its presence promised a challenge for which no amount of faith could truly prepare them. The archway did not lead to a treasure room or a grand hall. The chamber beyond was surprisingly small and utterly bare, save for a single presence that dominated the space. It was not a monster of flesh and blood, but a being of pure, collected history. The guardian was a golem, towering over them, its form a patchwork construct of thousands of leather-bound books, their pages fused together like stone bricks. Throughout this bizarre body were embedded shards of crystal, similar to the one Alara held but larger and darkly opaque, which pulsed with a faint, sickly light. As it shifted, the sound was not of grinding rock, but the soft, collective rustle of innumerable pages turning at once. Then it spoke, and the voice was not one voice, but a chorus, a haunting cacophony of whispers, shouts, and sighs that seemed to contain every scholar who had ever contributed to the libraries it was built from. You have navigated the path of echoes, the voices intoned, the words overlapping and merging, but to pass the final gate, you must prove the worth of your seeking. Not with strength, but with understanding. The conflict that followed was unlike any battle they had ever imagined. The Guardian did not raise a fist or summon a spell. Instead, it posed a question, its crystal shard eyes fixing on Alara. From which school of thought did the Aelid sorcerer, King Tamriel, derive his theory of stone law, and what was its fatal flaw? The air in the chamber grew heavy. Alara's mind, her greatest weapon, raced. She knew this. It was an obscure footnote in a text about Merethic era architecture. She recited the answer, her voice clear despite the tremor of fear. He derived it from the early Dwemer tonal architects, but his flaw was assuming all stone held a willing song. He failed to account for silent stone, which led to the collapse of his celestial orrery. For a moment, there was only the rustling of pages. Then, the Guardian gave a slow, ponderous nod. A correct answer, but the reprieve was brief. The next question was for Kaelen. Name the 3 primary spices used in the funerary rites of the Second Era Dragon Guard, and the symbolic reason for each. Kaelen, the looter, the man of practicalities, blanched. This was not about gold or traps, but his life had been spent in forgotten places, and he had a scavenger's eye for detail. He thought of the trinkets and offerings he'd seen in tombs. Saffron, for the purity of the soul's journey, he began, hesitantly. Fire petal, for the courage needed to face the afterlife. And dried scuttle, for the humility of returning to the dust. It was a guess, an amalgamation of half-remembered snippets from a dozen different cultures. The Guardian was silent for a terrifyingly long time before simply stating, accepted. The tension was a wire stretched to breaking. This was a battle of wits, where a single misremembered date or a confused fact could mean death. The true test came with the third question. The chorus of voices softened, becoming almost sorrowful. It asked not for a fact, but for a philosophy, directing its gaze to both of them. What in the final accounting is the purpose of memory? Why preserve what is past? This was the heart of it all. The reason the libraries were hidden, the reason for the parasites and the labyrinth. Elara, the scholar, instinctively reached for a grand, academic answer. She thought of the great historical cycles, the importance of learning from mistakes, the preservation of culture. But as she opened her mouth, she saw the Guardian's book-bound form seem to lean forward, as if unsatisfied with such rehearsed replies. It had heard those answers before. It wanted truth. Kaelen, who had been standing in terrified silence, surprised them all. He did not look at the Guardian, but at Alara, at her hands which had once held magic, and now held only a crystal. He thought of the frozen seeker they had buried, of the danger they had faced, of the sheer, stubborn refusal to give up that had brought them this far. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual cynicism, raw with an honesty he rarely showed. To remember why we try, he said. It was not a quotation from a great sage. It was not a complex theory. It was a simple, personal truth, born from the journey itself. It acknowledged the pain of the past, the failures they had witnessed, but affirmed the value of the effort nonetheless. The chamber fell utterly silent. The rustling of pages ceased. The guardian, this colossal being of accumulated knowledge, stood motionless. Then, the books that formed its body began to gently loosen, their bindings softening. The dark crystals within it flickered and faded. The answer is accepted, the chorus whispered, but now it was a single, unified voice, full of a profound and final peace. The purpose is the attempt. The memory of the effort is the legacy. With a sound like a vast sigh, the golem settled into a pile of ordinary, dusty books and inert crystal shards. The way forward was clear, but their victory had a cost. The act of judging them, of engaging its core programming one last time, had been the final expenditure of energy, sustaining the chamber's ancient magic. The last protective wards shimmered and died, and there, in the center of the room, where nothing had been a moment before, the air itself seemed to condense and solidify. The Nemic Egg manifested, no longer hidden. It was a pulsating sphere of soft, internal light, hovering just above the floor, and from it emanated a low, soft hum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones, a sound that was both invitation and warning. The Nemic Egg hung in the center of the chamber, a silent, breathing star. It was not a solid object, but a sphere of coalesced light, its surface shifting like liquid opal, pulsing with a gentle, rhythmic glow that echoed the beat of a sleeping heart. It seemed both incredibly ancient and utterly new, a condensation of pure potential. As Alara took a hesitant step forward, the air around it hummed in recognition. The faint, almost dead ember of her own magical signature, a ghost she could barely feel, was enough. The egg responded not as a tool, but as a kindred spirit. It brightened, and the light did not just shine, it unfolded. The chamber walls dissolved, replaced by a breathtaking, silent panorama. They were no longer in a cavern, but floating as silent observers in a grand, sun-drenched plaza of a city that defied imagination. Towers of crystalline lace spiraled into a sky filled with floating gardens, and mages robed in light-wove spells that painted the air with color. This was the zenith of the early Merethic era, a golden age of magic where knowledge flowed like water. They witnessed the founding of the great libraries, not as hidden tombs, but as vibrant universities, open to the sky, filled with the joyous clamor of discovery. The memory was so vivid, so full of life, that it was a physical ache compared to the silent ruins they had traversed. But the vision shifted. The brilliant sky darkened not with clouds, but with a creeping absence. It was a void that consumed not light, but meaning. They watched as a scholar, mid-sentence, would suddenly falter, his eyes going blank as the intricate spell he was demonstrating simply unraveled into nothingness. A floating garden, a masterpiece of botanical magic, would wilt and turn to gray dust in an instant, not from decay, but from being forgotten. The great threat the ancient mages had hidden from was not a monster with claws and teeth. It was conceptual, a sentient hunger for oblivion that fed on memory itself. It erased history, magic, and identity, leaving behind not destruction, but a terrifying, blank neutrality. The decision to hide the libraries was not one of fear, but of tragic, desperate preservation. They saw the last archmages, their faces etched with sorrow, using colossal spells to physically sever their greatest repositories of knowledge from the world, sinking them into swamps, burying them under ice, and sealing them behind labyrinths, all to starve the approaching void. They chose to let their world forget these wonders, so that the wonders themselves might survive. As the last ghostly image of the sealing rituals faded, returning them to the stark reality of the cavern, Alara was faced with a choice that fractured her very soul. The Nemic Egg hovered before her, its light seeming to offer itself to her. She could feel its potential. It held within it not just memories, but the raw substance of the magic that had created them. Her original, desperate goal was within reach. She could touch it, channel its energy into herself, and reverse the decay that had plagued her. She could be whole again, a mage restored. It would be so easy and so justified after all she had sacrificed. But she had just borne witness to a cataclysm. She had seen the vast, beautiful tapestry of what was lost, entire realms of understanding sacrificed to save a fragile hope. Her personal suffering, the hollow ache where her power once lived, suddenly felt infinitesimally small. To use the egg for herself would be the ultimate act of the very selfishness the ancient mages had fought against. It would be like using the last ember of an extinct sun to light a single candle. The true purpose of the artifact was clear. It was a seed, designed to be planted in the barren soil of the present age, to restore the forests of forgotten knowledge to the world. But to do that, to unleash its stored memory all at once, would require every shred of its power. It would mean expending the egg completely, destroying the legendary artifact, and with it, her last chance for a personal cure. The internal conflict was a silent, violent storm. It was the culmination of her entire journey, a choice between the woman she was when she breached the Ceporah Tower, desperate, singularly focused on her own survival, and the person she had become through dust, water, ice, and ethereal parasites. She looked from the egg's pulsating light to Kalin, who stood quietly, his usual cynicism replaced by a solemn awe. He offered no advice, only a quiet presence that reminded her she was no longer alone in her struggle. In that moment, the choice became clear. Her arc, from selfish desperation to selfless sacrifice, was complete. Her personal cure was a small, selfish thing when measured against the restoration of history itself. She would not be the one who saved herself. She would be the one who ensured that the sacrifices of the ancient mages and the frozen seeker in the snow were not in vain. Her decision was not spoken, but felt, as she reached out her hand, not to take, but to give, to offer her will as a conduit for the egg's true purpose. The artifact responded with a surge of joyous energy. It brightened until it was difficult to look upon, its gentle pulse accelerating into a triumphant, resonant frequency. But this activation was a two-edged sword. In awakening the egg's full purpose, she had also triggered its deepest security protocol. The immense release of stored memory acted as a beacon, a brilliant flare of historical truth in the silent universe. It was a signal that could not be ignored. The ground beneath their feet, which had been still for centuries, gave a sudden, deep, groaning shudder. The very stones of the cavern trembled as the great, nameless threat, the consumer of memory, stirred from its long slumber and turned its hollow gaze toward the source of the light. The ground did not simply shake. It seemed to dissolve into a profound, unnatural stillness. The triumphant light of the Nemic Egg did not fade, but instead, the space around it began to lose its substance. It started at the edges of the cavern, the intricate, memory-saturated stone of the labyrinth walls, not crumbling or cracking, but simply turning a flat, uniform gray. The fine details of carved glyphs and the subtle textures of age vanished, smoothed away into a blank nothingness, as if an invisible painter were applying a coat of pure oblivion over the world. This was the great threat, awakened by the egg's brilliant flare of memory. It was not a beast to be fought, but a void, a sentient, creeping absence that fed on the very concept of history. Where it passed, it did not leave rubble. It left a void where nothing had ever happened. The effect was immediate and horrifyingly personal. Kaelen, who had been watching the advancing grayness with wide-eyed terror, suddenly blinked and shook his head, as if trying to dislodge a fly. He looked at Alara, his expression shifting from fear to a blank confusion that was far more frightening. "You," he started, then faltered. Your name," it was, something with an E. A cold dread, deeper than any they had faced, gripped Alara. The void was not just consuming the ancient stone, it was consuming their present, eating the memories they were actively making. It was unmaking their journey, their partnership, their very awareness of each other, starting with the most recent and fragile recollections. The conflict transformed in an instant. This was no longer a race to an artifact. It was a desperate, rearguard action to protect the egg from the advancing tide of nothingness. They stood their ground before the pulsating sphere, their bodies a pathetic shield against a force that could erase mountains. But how do you fight a concept? How do you stab a silence or block a shadow? The void advanced without sound or speed, an inevitable tide that simply canceled everything in its path. The tension was a suffocating pressure, the utter helplessness of facing an enemy against which physical courage was meaningless. In that moment of paralyzing fear, Alara's mind, honed by their ordeal with the memory parasite, made a desperate connection. If the void fed on memory, then perhaps it could be starved, or at least resisted. It attacked the magical, the historical, the complex. But what about the simple? The mundane. She grabbed Kaelen by the shoulders, forcing him to look at her, to see her face, to anchor him in the now. "Kaelen, listen to me. Don't think about the journey. Don't think about magic or libraries or my name. Think of something else, something simple, something real." Her voice was frantic, but her eyes held a fierce certainty. Think of the sun, not a memory of a place, just the feeling of sunlight on your skin, the warmth of it. Can you feel it, right now in your mind? Hold on to that, nothing else, just the warmth. It was a decision born of their hardest-won wisdom, using the very tactic that had saved them from the parasite as a last-ditch defense. Kaelen, his face pale with the effort of remembering who he was, clenched his eyes shut. He fought against the fog in his mind, pushing away the terrifying blankness that sought to claim him. He focused all his will not on the epic adventure they had shared, but on the most basic, sensory memory he could grasp, the simple, physical sensation of warmth. He imagined standing outside the walls of any city on an ordinary day, feeling the sun beat down on his closed eyelids, heating his leather armor, a feeling devoid of history or magic, but rich with simple, undeniable life. His grip on reality held. The confused panic in his eyes receded, replaced by a grim, focused determination. He nodded at Alara, a silent confirmation that her anchor was holding. But the victory was local and terrifyingly fragile. While Kaelin's mind was secured, the void continued its silent, unstoppable advance. The chamber was shrinking, the walls of blankness closing in, and the brilliant light of the Nemic Egg seemed to be the only solid thing left in a universe being methodically unmade. They both knew, with a chilling and absolute clarity, that shielding the egg with their bodies was a futile gesture. The only way to stop the void was to fight absence with presence, to counter the hunger with a feast it could not consume. They had to unleash the egg's memories, all of them, in a single, catastrophic burst of light and information. Alara turned from the advancing grayness to look at the egg, then her gaze shifted to Kaelen. In that look, an entire conversation passed between them without a single word. She saw the understanding in his eyes, the understanding of what that act would mean. To unleash that much power would be to expend the artifact completely. It would mean her sacrifice, the final, irreversible severing of her last hope to restore her magic. It would mean embracing the mundane life she had fought so desperately to avoid. But it would also mean saving every memory the egg held, saving a world worth remembering. Kaelin's gaze did not hold pity or sorrow, but a profound, unwavering respect. It was an acknowledgement of the choice, and a silent promise that he would bear witness. The stakes had escalated to their absolute peak. The survival of the past and the meaning of the future hinged on this one, final, willing act of oblivion. There was no time for a grand speech, no moment for a final, tearful goodbye to the person she had been. The decision was made in the silent exchange of a single glance. Elara turned her back on the advancing void, that creeping tide of gray nothingness, and faced the Nemic Egg. It pulsed before her, a captured star, its light the only color left in a world being drained of meaning. She did not reach for it with greed or desperation, as she might have in the archives of Ceporah Tower. Instead, she opened her hands in a gesture of offering, of release. Closing her eyes, she did not search for a complex spell or an ancient incantation. There were no words grand enough for this. She simply reached inward, to the very core of her being, to the hollow, aching space where the river of her magic had once flowed. All that remained was a single, stagnant drop, the last dregs of a power that had defined her entire life, and she gave it away. She did not channel this final vestige of her life force into the egg to command it, or to siphon its power for herself. She poured it into the artifact as a catalyst, a spark to ignite the sun. It was the ultimate act of selfless magic, a spell of sacrifice, where the only intended effect was the utter annihilation of the caster's connection to the arcane. The moment her last spark of power touched the egg's brilliant surface, the world dissolved into pure, white sound. The gentle pulse became a deafening, silent thunderclap, a wave of energy that was not heat or force, but pure, unadulterated memory. It was the golden age of magic reborn in an instant, the laughter of forgotten mages, the scent of alien blossoms, the intricate equations for cities in the sky, the taste of power, and the bitter ash of failure, every stored experience within the egg unleashed in a single, catastrophic burst of creation. This wave of restored history met the advancing void not with violence, but with an overwhelming presence. The gray nothingness, which fed on absence and forgetting, recoiled from the sheer, undeniable something of it all. It was a battle of fundamental opposites, the void's nihilistic hunger against the defiant, joyous weight of existence, the blankness shattered like glass against the torrent of light and information, not defeated by a weapon, but simply filled, Where there had been a terrifying silence, there was now the vibrant, chaotic symphony of a remembered world. The victory was absolute. The sentient absence was banished, not to another place, but into irrelevance, drowned in a sea of everything it had tried to consume. But such a victory demanded an absolute cost. The feedback from the release was a physical, spiritual shock that tore through Alara. She felt it as a severing, a clean, irrevocable snap deep inside her soul. The hollow ache where her magic had been was no longer an empty space. It was simply her, the constant, humming awareness of the arcane that had been the background noise of her life since childhood was gone, replaced by a profound and permanent silence. She was left truly, completely mundane. The light of the egg, having expended every joule of its stored energy, could not sustain its form. As the last of the memories flooded out into the world, the beautiful, pulsating sphere fractured. With a sound like a dying sigh, it shattered into a million motes of inert, gray dust that settled to the cavern floor, leaving behind only the ordinary light of their torch. Elara did not crumple dramatically. She simply folded. Her knees buckled, not from pain, but from a final, exhaustive emptiness. The strength to stand, the will that had carried her through deserts, swamps, and frozen mountains, seemed to have been part of the sacrifice. But before she could hit the ground, Kaelen was there. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her shoulders, holding her upright. He had no magic to give, no grand power to add to the cataclysm. His contribution was simpler, and in that moment, far more vital. He added the weight of his own body, his own presence, to hers. He shared the physical and emotional burden of her sacrifice, bearing her up when she could no longer bear herself. This simple act, a far cry from the cynical looter who would have once pried the artifact from her cold fingers, cemented his transformation. He was no longer just her partner. He was a guardian, a witness to the price of memory. The immediate, terrifying conflict was over. The void was gone, the cavern was still, and the only sound was their ragged breathing in the sudden, ordinary silence. But the consequences of their action were only beginning. The burst of energy that had saved them did not simply vanish. It radiated outwards from the epicenter of the shattered egg, a shockwave of restored knowledge invisible to the eye, but palpable to the soul. This wave of memory began to race out across Tamriel, a silent tsunami of truth, destined to touch every corner of the continent. It would seep into the stones of ancient ruins, whisper into the dreams of sleeping mages, and stir forgotten legends in the hearts of common folk. The world had just been fundamentally, irrevocably changed, inoculated against forgetting. But for Alara and Kaelen, standing in the aftermath, the most immediate change was the profound, echoing quiet within one of them, and the new, unbreakable bond that silence had forged between them both. The profound silence that followed was a physical presence, heavier and more absolute than any noise. It was the silence of a storm that has passed, of a great engine that has finally ceased its roar. The blinding light of the Nemic Egg's final release faded, not into darkness, but into the mundane, steady glow of their single remaining torch. The labyrinth of shifting stone and haunting echoes was simply gone. In its place was a vast, empty cavern, its walls now ordinary, unadorned rock. The libraries they had traversed still existed somewhere in the world, their physical structures standing in swamps and under ice, but the potent, living magic that had animated them, the very essence that had tested and challenged them, had fallen quiet. It was a peace that felt earned, a stillness that was deeply reverent. Kaelen moved first, his own breath a loud sound in the newfound quiet. He saw Alara sway on her feet, her body listing like a ship that had lost its ballast. He was at her side in 3 long strides, his hands, usually so quick for a coin or an artifact, now gentle as they caught her under the arms. There was no hesitation, no calculation. He helped her to her feet, her weight leaning heavily against him. She was pale, her skin clammy, and the vibrant energy that had once hummed around her, even in its faded state, was utterly absent. Her hands, when he steadied them, were just hands, no trace of the magical current that had been as natural to her as breathing. Yet, when she lifted her gaze to meet his, he saw something there that he had never witnessed before. The frantic desperation, the grim determination, the shadow of loss, all of it had been burned away. Her eyes were clear, deep, and held a peace so profound it was almost unsettling. The struggle was over, and in its place was a quiet, unshakable acceptance. The immediate, life or death conflict had ended, but a new, more subtle tension took its place, the challenge of the aftermath. They stood together in the emptiness, 2 people bound by an experience that had fundamentally altered them both, left to grapple with the emotional wreckage of their victory. For Elara, the internal landscape was as changed as the cavern around them. The hollow ache where her magic had lived was no longer a wound. It was simply a part of her, a scar that told a story of survival. She felt a profound exhaustion, but it was the clean tiredness that follows a great labor completed, not the draining fatigue of a slow decay. She looked at the fine, gray dust on the floor, all that remained of the legendary Nemic Egg, and then at Kaelen, whose face was etched with a concern that was entirely new. In that moment, she made her final, defining choice, the quest for a personal cure. The desperate need to reclaim the power that had defined her now felt like the ambition of a different person. What she had gained was far greater. She had helped restore a lost history to the world. She had stood against oblivion itself, and she had not been alone. The memory of their shared journey, the knowledge of what they had prevented from being lost forever, was a more meaningful possession than any magical ability. This understanding was the final acceptance of her new identity, not as a failed mage, but as a preserver of truth. The personal journey had reached its conclusion, but the stakes of their actions had expanded to encompass the entire world. They had unleashed a tidal wave of restored memory, a silent energy that was even now rushing out from this cavern to seep into the foundations of Tamriel. What would that mean? Would it trigger a new golden age of magic, as scholars suddenly recalled long-lost secrets? Or would it sow chaos, as dangerous and half-understood truths fell into unprepared hands? They had no answers. They were the catalysts, but they would not be the authors of what came next. This unknown future was not an ending. It was a precarious and thrilling new beginning. Without a word, Alara took a tentative step, then another, her legs remembering their purpose. Kaelen kept a steadying hand on her arm, not because she needed to be held up, but as a simple anchor, a point of contact in a world remade. Together, they turned from the emptiness of the cavern and began the long walk back, following the faint upward slope toward a surface they had left behind a lifetime ago. They were walking into a changed world, carrying only the weight of their actions and the silent, unbreakable bond forged in the heart of a forgotten labyrinth.